5 months married, I found my wife still visited her ex on weekends. So I went too. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't go through her phone at 2 in the morning while she slept. I noticed a parking permit sticker on her car around month 2, looked up the zip code, wrote the address on a post-it, and put it in my desk drawer. I told myself it was nothing for 3 months. Then one Saturday I stopped telling myself that, called my friend Jonah, and said, "I need you to drive me somewhere." The woman who answered the door knew exactly who I was. She stepped back without a word. That post-it was still in my jacket pocket. I'm a structural engineer. I spend my days identifying where load-bearing systems are failing before the building tells you itself. I notice things I don't immediately say out loud. I notice the parking sticker because I'm the kind of person who reads stickers. I noticed the zip code didn't match anywhere Elena had mentioned. I wrote it down because writing things down is a reflex, not a plan. And then I filed it away the same way I file everything I'm not ready to examine yet. Elena and I met at a mutual friend's dinner party. She was a pediatric nurse, warm in a way that felt specific rather than performed. She asked follow-up questions, remembered what you'd said 20 minutes earlier, laughed at things that were actually funny. I'd dated people who were pleasant the way furniture is pleasant, inoffensive, present, contributing nothing. Elena was different. We were together 2 years before we married. I thought I knew the shape of her. The first time she came home later than expected, I was at the kitchen table with a work file and takeout getting cold. She texted, "Running behind, don't wait up." She was a nurse. Shifts ran over, I didn't wait up. The pattern assembled itself slowly, the way structural damage does, invisibly until it isn't. A missed dinner here, an errand that took 4 hours there. Around month 3, I noticed that the location sharing we'd turned on at the start of the marriage had stopped updating on her end. She said her phone had a glitch. I said okay and went back to whatever I was reading, because that is exactly the kind of thing I do. Accept a thin answer and file it next to the sticker and the zip code and all the other things I'm not examining yet. The scheduling app was the thing that finally ran the mechanism out of fuel. We shared a household calendar subscription through the hospital's system, her idea actually, so I'd know her shifts and could plan dinners without guessing. That Wednesday evening I was eating takeout alone because Elena was on a double shift. I glanced at the app. Her shift had ended at 3. It was now 7:45. I set down my fork. I opened the desk drawer and looked at the post-it. I didn't do anything with it that night. I closed the drawer, finished eating, washed the dish. Elena came home at 9, kissed me on the cheek, said the unit was chaos, and went to shower. I said, "I'm glad you're home. I am a very controlled person. Sometimes that quality is useful, and sometimes it is how you spend 3 months not examining a post-it." Saturday morning, she told me she was going to help her Aunt Renata with some things. She'd mentioned Renata before, an aunt on her mother's side, some family obligation, but I'd never met her. I said, "Okay, have a good time." I watched her leave. I went inside, stood in the kitchen for about 30 seconds, then called Jonah. Jonah is a fellow engineer. He doesn't editorialize. When I told him I had an address I wanted to check on, and I didn't trust myself to drive while feeling like this, he said what time, and I said now, and he said I'll be there in 10. He didn't ask what I expected to find. He probably understood that I didn't know. Elena's car was in the driveway. The apartment building was a modest ground floor unit in a quiet residential neighborhood. Accessible entrance ramp, wide door frame, the kind of modifications you add to a building, rather than build in from the start. I noticed all of this before I rang the bell because I was buying myself a few extra seconds, and also because I'm me. The woman who answered was in her late 50s, dark hair threaded with gray, an apron she'd forgotten she was wearing. She looked at me the way people look at a car accident. Immediate recognition, immediate dread. She didn't ask who I was. She stepped back. I said, "Is Elena here?" She turned without answering and walked down the hall. I stood in the open doorway. Jonah was still in the car. I could leave. I thought about leaving for approximately 1 second, then followed her inside. Elena appeared from a room off the hallway. She was wearing scrubs, not for a shift, just what she changed into when she was doing physical care. She looked at me and did not look surprised, not relieved, not panicked. She looked the way you look when you've been waiting for something uncomfortable and it has finally arrived. She said my name, just James. The way you say a name when you have nothing to attach to it yet. I said, "Is this where you've been coming?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Show me." She took me to the room. He was 29, lying in a hospital bed that had been moved into what was probably supposed to be a bedroom. There was adaptive equipment along one wall, a physical therapy chart on a whiteboard, a small television. He was thin in the way people get thin when their body has been through significant trauma and is still deciding what it wants to do next. There was a photograph on the wall, a beach scene, two young people, a hotel sign partially visible in the background. I registered it without yet understanding it. He looked at me and said, "She didn't tell you?" Not a question. I said, "No." He said quietly, "She should have." His name was Daniel. Elena said he was family. I asked what relation. She was quiet for a moment too long, and the woman from the door, Renata, his mother, said from the doorway, "He is my son." I looked at Elena. "And Renata is your mother's sister?" "Yes." "So he's your first cousin?" "Yes." I had to recalibrate. The story I'd assembled on the drive over, the one where Daniel was the ex-boyfriend, the one involving things I didn't want to think about, cracked down the middle and became something else entirely. Not simpler, more confusing. I said, "You told me he was an ex-boyfriend." "He was." She looked at the floor and then back at me. "We were young. We didn't know. When the family found out we were related, it ended. It was brief." Daniel spoke again, and his voice was even, careful, the voice of someone who has been in physical pain long enough to have stripped everything unnecessary out of his communication. "The accident was 14 months ago. Elena was driving. Another driver ran a red light. She wasn't charged." He paused. "I never asked her to keep coming here. I asked her to tell you." We were outside in the driveway after that. Elena and me, Renata hovering near the entrance. Elena started talking. The full version, being 19, a family reunion, not having grown up knowing each other because her mother and Renata had been estranged for years, discovering the connection through old documents, Renata's decision that it would be treated as though it had never happened, then the accident, the first hospital visit, the guilt compounding with every subsequent one, the fear that the combination of all of it, the history, the cover-up, the accident, the visits, would be too much. I listened to approximately 2 minutes of this and then said, "I need you to stop talking right now." I got into Jonah's car. He didn't ask how it went. He pulled away from the curb and drove in silence for a while. I sat with the Post-it in my jacket pocket and thought about the photograph on Daniel's wall, the beach, the hotel sign, two young people. Then I thought about the photograph on Elena's nightstand at home, the one she'd told me was an old friend who had passed away. Same photograph. When we were almost back, I said to Jonah, "She told me he was dead." He nodded once, slowly. "Okay," he said. "Where do you want to go?" I said home. I needed to see the photograph again with my own eyes. Elena's nightstand. I picked up the frame and looked at it carefully for the first time in 5 months of marriage. The beach, the hotel sign, Daniel, younger, standing next to Elena, very much alive. I put it face down. I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't sleep. She came home around 10. I heard her key in the lock, heard her set her bag down, heard the particular silence that meant she was deciding how to cross the distance between the front door and wherever I was. I was at the kitchen table. She came and stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment that went on longer than was comfortable. She said, "I know you need an explanation." I said, "I need you to sit down first." She sat. She had changed out of the scrubs. She looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been braced for impact for a long time and has now finally taken the hit. Part of me noticed that and filed it somewhere separate from the anger, because I'm not someone who stops registering humanity in people even when I'm furious at them. That quality is also not always useful. She talked for a long time. I let her. I had decided on the drive home that I would let her say everything before I responded to any of it, because interrupting her would only give her places to hide. So I listened to the whole architecture, being 19 at a family reunion, the particular coincidence of two sisters who had spent most of a decade estranged, neither family having introduced the children, a few months of phone calls and then visits. Then Renata found paperwork, old enough, official enough, and called Elena's mother Carla in a panic, and both women agreed in the same afternoon that it would be erased. Elena and Daniel were told separately. Elena complied. She said she was ashamed, which I believed. She said she and Daniel had been functionally strangers for 8 years, which I also believed. Then she got to the accident. Her car. A Sunday afternoon drive to a family event. The first time they'd been in the same vehicle since any of this happened, because Carla had insisted on one family dinner where everyone behaved normally and proved they had all moved on. Another driver, a red light, the kind of collision that takes less than a second and rearranges everything that follows. Daniel in surgery for 11 hours. Elena in a waiting room, then a hallway, then another waiting room, then eventually home, unhurt, which she said felt like its own particular punishment. She visited in the hospital because she couldn't not. She kept visiting after because the guilt had its own momentum. She didn't tell me because she'd made the calculation. I understood this even though she didn't say it this plainly. That the complete story, assembled in one place and handed to me, would be heavier than the relationship could carry. When she finished, I asked, "Did you tell your mother you were going to tell me eventually?" She said, "She knew I intended to." "Did she ask you to wait?" A pause. Not a long one, but specific. She said it would be better to get the marriage stable first. I closed the laptop I hadn't actually been using. "So your mother knew all of this before the wedding?" "Yes." "And Renata?" "Yes." I got up and made coffee, not because I wanted coffee, but because I needed to do something with my hands for 30 seconds. I stood at the counter with my back to her and thought about what it meant that the word stable had been used. Stable. As though I was a variable to be managed rather than a person to be told the truth. I called Elena's parents the next afternoon. Paolo answered. I asked for Carla. There was a brief shuffle and then Carla's voice, careful and warm in the way it always was with me, and I asked her directly whether she had known about Elena and Daniel before the wedding. She said yes. I asked whether she had considered telling me. She said, "It wasn't my story to tell." In the background I heard Paolo say, "What is happening?" I told him in one sentence. I kept it factual. There was a silence on his end that felt different from Carla's careful silences, rawer, less managed. He said he would call me back. He called 2 hours later. His voice was different. He said, "This should have been handled before you married her." He was not angry at me. He was angry at Carla, which I could hear underneath the controlled way he was speaking. He said, "I did not know." I believed him in the way you believe someone when their reaction is too unguarded to be performance. Paolo had been at our wedding. He had danced with Elena. He had shaken my hand at the reception and said he was glad Elena had found someone steady. He had not known. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. It meant the circle of people who had decided what I was allowed to understand about the family I was marrying into was smaller than it felt, and it meant that a reasonable person inside that family, someone who loved Elena, was also finding this unacceptable. I called the firm's in-house legal contact, not to file anything, just to understand the terrain. She explained the concept of annulment based on concealment of material facts, explained its difficulty in practical terms, explained what would need to be demonstrated. I thanked her and didn't hire her. I wasn't looking for an exit strategy. I was looking at a map so I knew where the roads went. Elena came home that evening to find me reading on the couch, which was such a normal image that it seemed to confuse her. She made dinner. We ate it at the table. She asked if I wanted to go to counseling. I said yes. I meant it. But that same evening, while I was brushing my teeth, she placed something on the kitchen counter and left it without comment. I found it when I came out. A printout of the police accident report. Her name, Daniel's name, the other driver's fault designation, the outcome summary. She'd printed it herself and left it there without explanation or framing, without asking me to acknowledge it or discuss it. I stood and read it twice. She hadn't been charged. Daniel's injuries were listed in the dry clinical language of official documents, which somehow made them worse to read than if the language had been emotional. I set it down. I went and found her in the other room and said, "How long were you going to keep this?" She said, "I don't know. That's the honest answer. I genuinely don't know." I said, "That is, at least, honest." We started counseling the following week. 2 sessions in, the counselor asked me what my threshold for staying looked like. I sat with the question for a while and couldn't answer it, not because I didn't have one, but because the threshold kept revealing new dimensions I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the visits themselves. It wasn't even the cover-up of the original relationship. It was the sustained, coordinated nature of what had been withheld. The multiple people, the multiple opportunities, the fact that decisions about what I was allowed to know had been made not once in a panic, but repeatedly across months, and then again across months of our marriage. I started paying closer attention to Elena's phone photos, not in the way that requires picking up someone else's phone, but in the way that I was remembering things she'd shown me while we were dating. She had shared an album of family photos early on. There was a gap I hadn't registered at the time. The summer she was 19 was largely absent. A few images, nothing connected to any particular trip or event. I cross-referenced it with a small detail I remembered from Daniel's room. The hotel sign partially visible in the beach photograph. I identified the hotel through some basic searching. I didn't confront her with this. I simply sat with the understanding that the version of her history she had offered me during the relationship had been curated, not carelessly, deliberately, with specific gaps in specific places. Around this time, Elena made what I think she believed was progress. She started telling me when she was going to Daniel's, the time, the duration, how he was doing. She stopped treating the visits as invisible. I recognized this as genuine effort, and I didn't dismiss it. But I also noticed that she'd mentioned to her mother that I was processing things well, and her mother had apparently relayed this to Renata, and this version, Marcus is processing it well, things are moving forward, had circulated through the same network of women who had managed information about me for years. Elena mentioned this to me approvingly, as evidence that we were moving towards something better. I looked at her and thought, she has misread my stillness as a decision. She thinks because I haven't left, that I have decided to stay in the same terms. She has confused me being controlled with me being settled. Then Renata called. I answered because I was curious. She said she wanted to take responsibility for the original decision to conceal the family history. She was sorry I found out the way I did. The family had only been trying to protect Elena. I asked, did anyone consider that I might need protecting too? She said, we didn't know you yet. You knew me at the wedding, Renata. You danced with me. Silence. She asked me not to end the marriage over something that had happened before Elena met me. I thanked her for calling. After I hung up, I sat with the specific shape of what had just happened. Renata had called me to protect something. Not me. The call was never about me. I went to my desk. I opened the drawer. The post-it was still there. Next to it, I placed a new item, a small notepad. I wrote one sentence at the top of the first page. Then I closed it and put it beside the post-it and closed the drawer. 2 days later, I asked Elena to write down every time she had made a decision not to tell me something. I explained it carefully, not as punishment, not as a document to be used against her, but as the only method I could think of by which I would be able to see whether we were talking about a few significant omissions or a sustained architecture of management. She looked afraid when I asked. Not of me. I want to be clear about that. She looked afraid of the list. She agreed. I went to work the next morning. When I came home, the notepad was on the kitchen counter with 11 items written in her handwriting. I poured a glass of water. I stood at the counter and read every one. The last item said, I almost told you on our wedding night. Renata called me during the reception. She asked me to wait. I put the glass down very carefully. I photographed every page with my phone before I moved anything else. I read the list 4 more times that night. Not because I needed to memorize it, but because I kept expecting the last item to change. It didn't. I already knew Renata had made decisions that weren't hers to make. But there is a difference between suspecting that someone intervened in your marriage and reading it in your wife's handwriting on a Wednesday night in your own kitchen. Renata had called during the reception. Elena had answered. And then she had come back to the table and danced with me and cut the cake with me and said her vows were the truest things she'd ever spoken. I put the notepad in the desk drawer next to the post-it. I sat in the kitchen for a while. I wasn't angry in the loud sense. I was doing the thing I do where I go very still and audit. What I understood by the end of that night was this. The problem was never Daniel. Daniel was a person in a modified bedroom who had been honest with me in 5 minutes when given the chance. The problem was the committee. 3 women across multiple years had convened repeatedly around the question of what I was permitted to understand about the family I married into, and they had answered that question for me, consistently, without consulting me, right up to and including my own wedding reception. My marriage had a structural flaw I hadn't been allowed to inspect. I called Paolo the next morning. I told him I wanted to arrange a dinner, Elena, Carla, Paolo, and me, and I told him what its purpose was. I needed Elena to say the full story out loud to her parents, not as performance, not as punishment. I needed to see whether she could do it in front of the people whose silence had made it necessary. And I needed Carla to sit in a room and hear her daughter account for what that silence had cost. Paolo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll arrange it. Saturday." He told Carla there was something important to discuss. He didn't tell her what. Renata was not invited. That was my one condition, and Paolo didn't push back on it. Saturday arrived the way difficult things do. Ordinary weather, ordinary traffic. The particular absurdity of the world proceeding normally while you drive towards something that will not be normal. Elena knew what the dinner was for. I had told her Thursday. She'd sat with it for 2 days and hadn't tried to renegotiate. That itself told me something. Paolo and Carla's dining room. 4 people. A table set out of habit or courtesy. Food nobody was particularly planning to eat. Carla looked at me when I came in with the expression of someone who has been partially briefed and is hoping the partial briefing is the complete version. I sat down and said, "Elena is going to explain something to both of you. I'm going to listen." Carla looked at Elena. Elena looked at me once, then at her parents, and began. She talked for close to 20 minutes. She said everything. The reunion, the relationship, Renata's discovery, the agreement between Renata and Carla to erase it, the accident, the visits, every item on the list, and finally, the last one. Renata's call on the wedding night. She said it plainly, looking at her mother, and I watched Carla's face do something complicated that was not quite surprise because she had known most of the facts. But hearing them assembled and recited in sequence in front of me was different from holding them privately. There is a specific discomfort in watching the architecture of a decision become visible from the outside. Paolo said nothing until Elena finished. Then he turned to Carla. His voice was even. "You knew this before the wedding." Carla said, "It was absolutely yours." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "He married our daughter." Carla turned to me. I think she had prepared something measured and maternal, some version of "we were protecting Elena" that would invite me to be generous. What she said instead was, "We intended to tell you. After the first year, once things were settled, Elena was going to—" I said, "Stop." She stopped. I said, "There was a plan." Nobody answered. "You had a timeline. It wasn't silence. It was a scheduled disclosure." I looked at Carla. "You were going to tell me when it was convenient." She said, "We thought it would be easier." For whom? The table was quiet. Paolo was looking at his hands. Elena was looking at me. Carla had no clean answer because there wasn't one. I reached into my jacket pocket. I put the post-it on the table. Or, it had a zip code and a street address written on it in my handwriting, 3 months old, slightly worn at the fold. I said, "I wrote this down in month 2 of our marriage. I found the zip code on a parking sticker on Elena's car." I told myself it was nothing every week for 3 months because I trusted her, and I trusted that if something was wrong, she would tell me. Until I stopped telling myself that. I looked at Elena. I went there because I needed to see what was real. And the most honest conversation I had that day was with the man your family has spent years treating as a secret. Elena's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. I said to Carla, "I want you to understand something. I was not the threat you were managing. I was the person you were managing the truth away from. That is a different thing." Carla opened her mouth and then closed it. Paolo said quietly, "She's right, Carla." He looked at me. "I'm sorry. What was done to you in this family was wrong." I thanked him. I meant it. I texted Jonah from the table. Not needed, but thank you. He had been sitting on the documented timestamp of our visit to Daniel's address for weeks. The date, the time, notes from his phone. I hadn't needed it. The family's own words, spoken in sequence in a dining room, had been sufficient. I drove home alone. Elena stayed at her parents'. I sat in the car outside our building for a while, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the specific quiet that follows something that has finally been said out loud. Then I went upstairs. The beach photograph was still face up on her nightstand where I'd put it back weeks ago. I looked at it without picking it up. 2 young people, a coastal hotel sign, a moment from a summer that had been edited out of the version of her life she'd handed me. I understood it differently now. Not as evidence of deception, I'd passed that point, but as a document of something that had happened to her too. Something she'd been told to make disappear, something she'd been carrying in the only way she knew how. I left it where it was and went to make tea. She came home 2 days later. She stood in the hallway and asked if I wanted her to leave. I said, "I want you to understand what you did, not what your family did, what you did." She said, "I chose their comfort when I should have chosen you." That was the sentence. Not the elaborate explanation in the dining room, not the 11 items on the list, not Renata's call or Carla's timeline. Just that. She chose their comfort and made it mine to carry, and she knew it, and she said it without softening it or redirecting it. I said, "Yes." She said she was sorry. She said she knew that wasn't enough. I said, "Tell me what you would have done differently." She thought about it genuinely, which I noticed. "I would have told you about Daniel before we got engaged. I would have told you about the accident. I would have let you decide whether you could accept it. What stopped you? I was afraid you'd leave. And now?" She said, "I'm still afraid, but I would rather you leave knowing the truth than stay not knowing it." I sat with that. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in 5 months of marriage, possibly in 3 years of knowing each other. It cost her something to say it. I could see that. I told her the marriage could continue on 2 conditions. The first, no managed information. I wasn't asking to know her every thought or feeling. I was asking that anything affecting my basic understanding of the family I'd married into came to me in real time, not on Renata's schedule or Carla's timeline. The second, I would not attend family events where Renata was present until Renata spoke with me directly. Not an apology performance, a genuine direct conversation. After that, I'd decide what I wanted that relationship to be. Elena agreed to both. I believe she meant them. I also understood that meaning something and doing something are different categories, and that I would be paying attention. 1 week later, I went back to Daniel's address alone. I told Elena I was going. She looked at me for a moment and then nodded. He was awake, doing an arm exercise with a resistance band when I came in. He set it down. I sat in the chair by the window and we talked for 40 minutes about the accident, about the guilt Elena carried, about what he actually wanted from whatever remained of his life, which was to finish his physical therapy program and eventually live independently somewhere and not be the unspoken subject at the center of a family drama that exhausted him. He said the visits from Elena were not the problem. The secrecy was the problem. I said, "She's going to keep coming. It won't be secret anymore." He said, "That's all I ever wanted." We didn't become friends, but I shook his hand when I left and meant the gesture, which is not nothing. Renata called the following week. She said she wanted to apologize. I agreed to meet her for coffee. She apologized without deflection. She had made a decision that was not hers to make on my behalf. The cover-up had been wrong. She understood now that protecting Elena had not required deceiving me. I thanked her. I didn't invite her to the apartment. I said we'd see where things were in a few months, and I meant that too. Carla and Paolo came for dinner 2 weeks after the dining room. It was uncomfortable in the way that honest things sometimes are, after a long period of managed comfort. Paolo brought a bottle of wine and shook my hand at the door for slightly longer than necessary. Carla was careful and genuine in equal measure, which was more than I'd expected. We ate. We talked about other things, and occasionally the real thing. It was not fixed. It was real, which I had decided was worth more. Elena reinstated the location sharing, mutually, properly, both directions this time, not surveillance. Just the ordinary transparency of 2 people who have agreed to be in each other's lives without redactions. I kept the notepad. I didn't throw it away or show it to anyone or do anything significant with it. It sat in the desk drawer where the post-it had been, which now seemed like the right place for a document of what had been withheld and what it had cost. The following Saturday, Elena got ready to go to Daniel's. She told me the time. She told me the address, as though I didn't know it, as though she needed to say it out loud to make the visit a fact we both held rather than one she carried alone. She said approximately how long she'd be. I said, "Okay." I watched her pull out of the parking space from the kitchen window. I went to my desk, opened the drawer. The post-it was still there beside the notepad. I picked it up and looked at the address I'd written in month 2 of my marriage. The zip code, the street, the number I'd copied from a parking sticker while pretending I wasn't doing anything significant. I held it for a moment. Then I set it in the recycling bin under the desk. I didn't need it anymore. I knew where she was going. She told me. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The street outside was ordinary. A neighbor walking a dog, someone loading groceries. The specific Saturday quietness of a building full of people going about their lives. The coffee finished. I poured a cup. I went back to the desk and left the drawer open, the notepad visible inside it. Not as a reminder of what she'd done, as a record that the hidden shape of things could be named, and that I was someone capable of naming them, and that I had.